In a bustling courtroom, Judge David Hollis sat behind his large oak desk, the gavel resting beside him as the murmur of the crowd echoed through the room. The air thick with anticipation today was no different than any other day, at least that's what he thought as he glanced down at the list of cases before him, most of them minor offenses, people making small mistakes in their everyday lives, nothing that would stand out. But then Naomi King stepped into the room, and everything shifted. Her presence was undeniable. Though she didn't speak a word as she entered, all eyes subtly turned toward her. She moved with an effortless grace, her tailored suit immaculate, her expression unreadable as she approached the defendant's bench. Judge Hollis watched her with a practiced eye, someone who had been in the courtroom long enough to know how to read people. He had seen it all before, confident professionals who thought they could talk their way out of anything, the so-called power players who believed their status could change the course of justice. He assumed she was just like them, a woman trying to avoid responsibility, someone whose position and confidence would allow her to talk circles around the situation and dismiss the consequences that came with it. It was the type of person that Judge Hollis didn't tolerate, but he was prepared to handle whatever came his way. Naomi stood before him, her back straight, her hands clasped politely in front of her. She didn't seem nervous or out of place, not like the usual defendants that often fidget or show signs of anxiety in front of a judge. There was a quiet strength in her silence, something that piqued his curiosity. But it wasn't enough to change his approach. He read the details of the case with a firm gaze before addressing her, his voice loud and clear, echoing through the room. This was a simple matter, nothing too complicated, a fine that was in order, a minor infraction in the grand scheme of things. But to Judge Hollis, it was a sign of something else, a lack of discipline, something that needed to be corrected. He looked up at her from behind his glasses, his eyes narrowing slightly before speaking. "You've been charged with a traffic violation. I trust you understand the importance of following the rules of the road," he asked, his tone clipped and formal. Naomi nodded once, her voice calm, as she answered, "Yes, Your Honor, I understand the importance of following the law." Her words were measured, her demeanor composed, but to Judge Hollis, they seemed to lack the sincerity he expected from someone who had made such an oversight. He could sense a certain detachment in her response, as though she was used to playing the game a little too well for his liking. He cleared his throat and addressed her with a hint of finality in his voice. "I'm going to impose a fine." He stated no further explanation needed. He knew what needed to be done, and this was a simple decision. She would pay the price like anyone else. She accepted the ruling without protest, her eyes still holding his gaze with an air of quiet dignity. She stepped away from the bench and moved toward the exit without haste. Without looking back, she left the courtroom as silently as she had entered, but something lingered in the air long after she was gone. Judge Hollis couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this woman than her polished exterior. Something about her made him wonder if he had missed something, if there was more to this moment than just a routine case. As Naomi exited the courtroom, her footsteps echoed in the hallway, but she walked with a measured pace, as though the judgment had not affected her in the slightest. Her composure was unwavering, a quiet dignity in the way she carried herself that made her seem almost untouchable. The hustle and bustle of the courthouse seemed distant to her as she moved past the crowded corridors and out into the bright afternoon sun. Naomi's thoughts weren't on the fine or the fleeting moment she had spent in the courtroom. No, her mind was already back on the work that mattered, the reforms she was tirelessly advocating for, the policies she was pushing forward behind closed doors where true change was being made. But to anyone observing her, she appeared just like any other defendant, someone caught up in the system waiting to pay a price for a small mistake. Judge Hollis watched her leave the courtroom from his high bench, but there was something about Naomi's presence that stayed with him long after she was gone. It wasn't just her composed exterior or the way she moved through the space with a quiet authority. It was something deeper, an aura of calm that seemed to exude from her, even in the face of being fined, something that most people would resist or argue against. She hadn't challenged his decision. She hadn't even flinched. When he handed down the penalty, she had simply accepted it and walked away. As the judge sat back in his chair, he found himself intrigued, something in him unsettled by the encounter. He had seen many people come and go from his courtroom, but Naomi King had left an impression on him that he couldn't quite shake. He didn't know what it was, but there was a nagging curiosity that crept up on him As he reviewed the rest of the cases for the day, his thoughts kept returning to Naomi, her calm demeanor, and her graceful acceptance of a decision that could have easily angered someone else. In all his years on the bench, Hollis had never encountered someone like her. Sure, there were the usual suspects who would argue their cases vigorously, who would plead for leniency or attempt to manipulate the system to their advantage. But Naomi wasn't like them. She didn't play the game, and that made him wonder who she really was. Why would someone so composed and confident find themselves in his courtroom for such a minor issue? Was she just another person who believed they were above the law, or was there something more to her than that? The thought lingered in his mind as the day wore on, and even as the courtroom slowly emptied and he returned to his chambers, the feeling of Naomi's presence stayed with him. There was a quiet power in the way she had carried herself, something that told him she was used to being in control, but not in a way that demanded attention. Rather, it was the kind of power that came from a deep belief in something larger than herself, something beyond the confines of the courtroom or the immediate consequences of a fine. The next morning, as Judge Hollis sat at his desk sipping his coffee, his mind wandered back to the case. It was a small matter, but his curiosity couldn't be satisfied. He called his assistant into the office with a vague request to pull up some information on Naomi King. There had to be more to her than the woman he had seen in the courtroom. Surely there was a reason she had held herself with such quiet authority. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find, but something told him that the woman he had just found was far from ordinary. Judge Hollis sat at his desk, scanning through the files his assistant had provided, but it wasn't the mundane paperwork he usually handled that caught his attention. It was Naomi King's name that seemed to jump off the page, followed by her credentials and affiliations, and he felt a tightening in his chest as he read through her biography. Naomi King wasn't just any defendant. She was a leader, a prominent figure in the field of criminal justice reform. The very woman he had fined for a minor traffic infraction was the federal leader for criminal justice reform, responsible for shaping policies that aimed to dismantle the very biases embedded in the legal system. The realization hit him like a punch in the gut. He had made an assumption, and it had been terribly wrong. Her resume was nothing short of extraordinary. Naomi had spent years advocating for policies aimed at transforming the criminal justice system, policies that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment, fairness over discrimination. She had worked with lawmakers at the federal level to push for legislation that tackled mass incarceration, fought for more resources for mental health services in prisons, and worked tirelessly to ensure that the system treated all individuals equitably, regardless of race, gender, or socioeconomic status. The more Hollis read, the more his shame grew. This wasn't just any person he had fined. This was someone working tirelessly for change at the highest levels of government. His decision had been not only wrong but thoughtless. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of his discovery settling heavily on his shoulders. Naomi King wasn't just a minor figure in the community. She was a force, a person whose influence extended far beyond the walls of his courtroom. How had he failed to recognize this? He had judged her based on nothing more than a traffic violation and the way she presented herself, polite, composed, and seemingly unflappable. But he hadn't looked beyond the surface. Hollis had been so quick to assume that she was just another person who thought they could get away with the rules, someone who would bend under the pressure of authority. He had failed to see her for who she truly was. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how often he had made similar assumptions in the past. How many times had he passed judgment on others without truly understanding their circumstances or their backgrounds? How many people had entered his courtroom and left with nothing but a sense of being misunderstood, their true worth and struggles never seen? He had prided himself on being a fair judge, but the truth was he had been blinded by his own biases, by the very things he had spent years presiding over without a second thought. He needed to know more about Naomi King, not just for the sake of his professional integrity, but because her story had become personal to him. He needed to understand how someone like her, someone so clearly committed to change, had ended up in his courtroom. He needed to understand her, and more importantly, he needed to understand the mistakes he had made in his own judgment. As the hours passed and the quiet of his chambers settled around him, Hollis couldn't help but feel a deep sense of regret. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. It was about realizing that he had missed an opportunity, a chance to engage with someone who could have taught him something important about justice and fairness. Instead, he had handed down a decision that felt like a misstep, a failure to recognize the bigger picture. He sat back in his chair, thinking about what to do next. What was the right course of action now that he understood who Naomi really was? Would an apology suffice, or had he already done enough damage? Judge Hollis sat alone in his chambers, the quiet of the room pressing in on him as the weight of the discovery about Naomi King settled deeper. He had learned that Naomi wasn't just a key player in criminal justice reform. She was a beacon of change, someone whose life's work was centered around tackling the very issues he had spent years managing within the judicial system. His mind raced as he replayed the courtroom scene in his head, her poised demeanor, her silent acceptance of his fine, her unspoken power, and he couldn't escape the growing discomfort that gnawed at him. How had he missed it? How had he allowed his own biases to color his perception of her? The fine he'd handed down felt trivial in the wake of this revelation. It wasn't just that Naomi King was influential. It was that she was trying to change the very system that had sentenced her to that moment in his courtroom. How could he, a man who had built a career based on fairness, make such an oversight? It seemed ironic now that he, of all people, had failed to recognize someone who was working to create a system that would prevent exactly what he had just done. Hollis paced across the room, the carpeted floor muffling his footsteps as he tried to make sense of his feelings. There was no denying that he had misjudged Naomi, but there was something else that bothered him even more: his own complicity. He had been part of a system that often failed to see the full humanity of people, particularly those from marginalized communities. The courtroom had always been a place where the law was the law, where there were rules and consequences. He had taken pride in being impartial, in being the one to apply those rules with absolute certainty. But now, in the wake of his discovery about Naomi, everything felt different. His role, once so clear and defined, now felt much more complicated. The hardest part was confronting the truth about himself. How many times had he sentenced people to fines or penalties without considering the broader context of their lives? How many individuals had stood before him, quietly accepting their fate, just like Naomi had, while their true stories went unheard? The thought made him uneasy, but it was one he couldn't ignore. Naomi had shown him, in one swift moment, how easy it was for someone in his position to miss the bigger picture. It wasn't just about this single case anymore. It was about the way he had been judging people all along, quick to apply the rules, quick to see what was in front of him, but slow to understand the deeper implications of his decisions. Judge Hollis had always prided himself on being fair, on being someone who could separate his personal feelings from his professional duties, but now he wasn't so sure. He had become so focused on the letter of the law that he had lost sight of its spirit. He had failed to see the complex human beings behind the cases he presided over. Naomi King's name kept echoing in his mind, and he couldn't stop thinking about her calm, dignified face as she had accepted his ruling. He felt a deep sense of regret that she had been subjected to his narrow view of justice. He couldn't undo the fine he had imposed, but he knew that the moment he had shared with her was now a turning point, both for him personally and for how he would approach his future cases. The old ways of judging people by their surface actions, by the quick assumptions he had made, could no longer stand. But what could he do about it? Apologizing for the fine might be a start, but was it enough? Could one apology repair the damage done, not just to Naomi, but to the countless others he might have wronged throughout his career? The more Hollis thought about it, the more he realized that an apology alone wouldn't suffice. It was time for a change, not just in how he treated Naomi, but in how he viewed the very system he was a part of. As the day faded into night, Hollis made a decision. He needed to meet Naomi, not to beg for forgiveness, but to learn from her, to understand her perspective, and perhaps to start the hard work of transforming the way he approached justice. The next day, he would reach out to her. He only hoped it wasn't too late to begin righting his wrongs. The next day, Judge Hollis sat at his desk, drafting the letter he had been wrestling with all night. His pen hovered over the paper as he tried to find the right words to express what he was feeling: regret, confusion, humility, and a deep desire to make things right. He knew that an apology was only the first step, but he wasn't sure what else he could do. His thoughts kept returning to Naomi, her unshakable calm, and the way she had accepted his decision without resistance, without a hint of protest. It was as though she had known, all along, that the encounter was but a brief blip in her much larger mission. He had underestimated her, he realized, and in doing so, had underestimated the very system he was a part of. Naomi, on the other hand, had no idea that Judge Hollis had spent the previous night turning his world upside down. Her day had been just like any other, filled with meetings, phone calls, and the constant juggling of the numerous projects she was overseeing. She was working on legislation that could change the way the justice system dealt with nonviolent offenders, pushing for programs that emphasized restorative justice over punitive measures, and collaborating with activists who were advocating for better treatment of marginalized communities. Her life was a whirlwind of advocacy and progress, but it wasn't something she sought to broadcast. She wasn't interested in fame or recognition. She was interested in results, real, tangible change. She had grown used to the complexities of working within a system that seemed designed to resist change, but she knew that the work was essential. Every conversation, every piece of legislation, every collaboration mattered. And yet, there were moments when Naomi felt the weight of her own role. It wasn't just the long hours or the complexity of the work. It was the constant fight against a system that had long been set in its ways. It was exhausting and sometimes disheartening, but Naomi had never been one to shy away from challenges. The future she imagined for the criminal justice system was one where fairness and equity were the guiding principles, not punishment and retribution. It was a dream that drove her every day. So when she received a call from Judge Hollis requesting a meeting, Naomi wasn't immediately sure what to expect. She had, of course, heard of him, a well-known figure in the local legal community, a judge with a reputation for being tough but fair. But she didn't know him personally. She assumed that, like many others in her field, he would simply view her as another policy advocate, someone trying to force change from the outside. She had never expected her brief appearance in his courtroom to lead to a request for a meeting. When they sat down together in a quiet cafe later that week, Naomi was poised as always, but there was an air of curiosity in her as well. She listened intently as Judge Hollis apologized, explaining how his discovery about her had changed his perspective on the fine he had imposed and his broader views on the justice system. He spoke about his internal struggle, his acknowledgement that he had allowed his biases to cloud his judgment, and the realization that he had missed an opportunity to engage with someone who was doing the work he himself had failed to see. Naomi listened patiently, not interrupting, her face thoughtful but neutral. When he finished, there was a long pause. She wasn't angry, and she didn't seem surprised. She had seen this before. The realization in people that the system they had upheld was deeply flawed, that they had been complicit in maintaining its injustices. What mattered, she knew, was what happened next. "You know," Naomi said finally, breaking the silence, "this is about more than just one case, Judge. It's about the system we're all part of. You're not the first person to recognize that change is needed, but it's one thing to understand it and another to act on it. You're already ahead of many others by simply acknowledging the problem. The next step is to figure out how to be part of the solution." Hollis nodded, grateful for her calm demeanor and the wisdom that seemed to flow effortlessly from her. This wasn't just about the fine. It was about understanding that justice wasn't a simple matter of applying the law. It was about recognizing the human beings in front of him, the stories and struggles that shaped their lives. "I want to learn more," he said earnestly. "I want to understand how I can be part of the change you're working for. I'm not asking for a shortcut. I know it's a long road, but I want to be on it with you." Naomi smiled slightly, a knowing look in her eyes. It wasn't the first time someone had come to her for guidance, but there was something different in the judge's approach. He wasn't asking for absolution. He was asking for a path forward. "Then we'll walk it together," she said quietly, her voice steady and full of resolve. And just like that, a new partnership was born, one that would change not only Judge Hollis' perspective, but the course of his future decisions as well. In the weeks that followed, Judge Hollis found himself grappling with a new sense of purpose. The meeting with Naomi King had been a revelation, but the journey that lay ahead of him wasn't going to be simple. He had made a commitment to himself and to Naomi that he would begin to change the way he approached justice, and that was no small task. It wasn't just about doing things differently in his courtroom. It was about rethinking everything he had been taught to believe about the law, and more importantly, about the people whose lives the law affected. Naomi had offered him a starting point, learning from the very communities he had spent so many years judging. She encouraged him to visit rehabilitation programs, to sit down with people who had been incarcerated, and to listen to their stories, not as a judge, but as a human being. It was a challenge, one that felt uncomfortable at first. Hollis had spent so long in a role that required him to remain detached, to view cases through the lens of legal principles, that the idea of connecting on a personal level with defendants seemed foreign. But Naomi's words stayed with him. Change, she had said, began with empathy. And so, Hollis started small. He began visiting local prisons and meeting with incarcerated individuals who were part of rehabilitation programs. The first time he walked through the prison gates, he was overwhelmed by a mixture of emotions, guilt, sadness, and an unsettling realization that he had never truly seen these people before. They weren't just criminals or statistics in a report. They were fathers, mothers, sons, and daughters. People who had made mistakes, yes, but people who still had the capacity to change. He listened to their stories, stories of broken homes, of addiction, of poverty, and he felt his own worldview slowly begin to crack open. One afternoon, Hollis sat in a circle with a group of inmates. There was an elderly man, once a teacher, who had spent decades in prison after a mistake in his youth. There was a young woman, barely in her 20s, who had been caught up in a violent crime after years of abuse at home. Hollis listened, silently at first, as they spoke about their lives, their regrets, and their dreams for the future. He couldn't help but feel a profound sense of guilt. These were people whose humanity he had failed to recognize for so long. They weren't just subjects of a case. They were people, individuals deserving of second chances, of compassion, of opportunities for redemption. It was hard for him to reconcile the man he had been, someone who had followed the law without question, with the person he was becoming, someone who now saw the faces behind the statistics. But with every story he heard, with every interaction he had, Hollis began to see the law through a new lens. He started to question the harshness of some of the sentences he had imposed in the past, the sheer lack of rehabilitation in the system. Was the goal of the system to punish, or was it to restore? He began to implement small changes in his courtroom. He made an effort to engage with defendants more thoughtfully, asking questions about their backgrounds and motivations. He didn't just issue sentences without consideration of their personal stories. He began to consider alternatives to incarceration when possible, looking into programs that offered education, job training, and mental health support. He wasn't softening his approach. He was broadening it, recognizing that there were deeper issues at play than just the crime itself. Meanwhile, Naomi continued to work with him behind the scenes, helping him navigate the complexities of criminal justice reform. She introduced him to policy experts, activists, and even victims of crime who believed in restorative justice. It wasn't easy. There were many in his circle who resisted the idea of change, who believed that the system was fine just the way it was. But Hollis was no longer the same man who had walked into that courtroom months ago. He had seen the cracks in the system, and now he was determined to do something about it. As the months passed, Hollis found himself becoming more involved in the reform efforts Naomi had been championing. He spoke at conferences, joined task forces, and began advocating for legislative changes that could make a real difference in the lives of those affected by the justice system. The man who had once seen his role as simply enforcing the law had evolved into someone who believed in the law's potential to heal. It wasn't perfect, and the road ahead was still long. There were days when the weight of his past decisions felt heavy, when he wondered if it was too late to make up for the years of blind adherence to the system. But every conversation, every change he pushed for, was a step in the right direction. With Naomi by his side, Hollis knew that they were part of something much larger than themselves, a movement toward justice, compassion, and, ultimately, real change. And perhaps, just perhaps, they were proving that even the most entrenched systems could be reimagined, one small step at a time. Despite the progress Hollis had made, the road to transformation was not without obstacles. As his involvement in criminal justice reform deepened, he encountered resistance from several corners. Some of his colleagues in the judiciary were skeptical of his new approach, questioning whether it was a betrayal of their shared duty to uphold the law as it stood. They warned him that changing the system from within could risk the very integrity of the legal process. Others in the community, who had witnessed the failings of the justice system firsthand, were wary of his motives, wondering whether his newfound commitment to reform was sincere or merely a form of redemption-seeking. One day, Hollis attended a meeting with a group of fellow judges and law enforcement officials, many of whom had known him for years. The conversation quickly turned contentious when he brought up the idea of reducing mandatory minimum sentences for nonviolent offenders and expanding rehabilitative programs. He proposed that courts be given more discretion in sentencing, allowing judges to consider the full context of an individual's life rather than applying strict, one-size-fits-all rules. The room grew tense as a few senior judges voiced their concerns. "Judge Hollis, we've been down this road before," said Judge Carla Thompson, a seasoned colleague. "We know that these programs are well-intentioned, but they often fail. The public demands accountability. If we start making exceptions, what happens to the victims who have suffered? What happens when we let people off too easy?" Hollis knew these arguments well. He had once been on the side of those who believed in tough sentencing, believing that it was the only way to ensure justice. But he had seen the flaws in that thinking firsthand. He had listened to the stories of inmates, seen the recidivism rates, and witnessed the way the system had failed to address the root causes of crime. He knew it wasn't enough to simply impose punishment. They had to offer a path forward for redemption. "Justice isn't just about retribution," Hollis replied, his voice steady but firm. "It's about rehabilitation, giving people a chance to prove they can change. I've seen too many people trapped in a system that doesn't allow for second chances. How is that fair?" The room was silent for a moment. Judge Thompson looked at him sharply, as though weighing his sincerity. Finally, she spoke. "Fairness? I don't know about that, Judge. I understand what you're saying, but you're playing with fire. The public doesn't want to hear about empathy and rehabilitation when they see headlines about violent crime. They want consequences. They want justice. You're risking your credibility, and ours." Hollis felt a knot form in his stomach. He had known the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but hearing the doubts of his peers made the weight of his commitment feel even heavier. Naomi had warned him that this was the reality of change. Resistance would come from unexpected places. And yet, despite the pressure, he wasn't ready to give up. He had seen too much to turn back now. He met Naomi soon after the meeting, his mind swirling with frustration and doubt. He told her about the conversation and the pushback he was facing. "I'm not sure I'm cut out for this," Hollis admitted. "It feels like I'm fighting everyone, the public, my colleagues, even parts of myself. How can we possibly make progress when the system is so entrenched in its ways?" Naomi listened carefully, her expression thoughtful. "The system is built on years of tradition, Judge. It's no surprise that change is met with resistance, but you're already changing it. One person at a time, one case at a time. You're making a difference, even if it feels small right now. The resistance is part of the process. You can't back down now. What we're doing is bigger than us. It's about the people who are being failed every day by the system." Her words were like a salve for his weary soul. He had been expecting resistance, but that didn't make it any easier to face. Naomi was right, though. This fight was larger than the immediate battles, larger than the pushback from his peers. It was about the millions of lives affected by a broken system, and it was about ensuring that people like Naomi, who had dedicated their lives to this cause, weren't left to fight alone. Hollis took a deep breath, the determination returning to his chest. "I don't back down," he said firmly. "I'll keep fighting. I'll prove them wrong." And with that resolve, he returned to the task at hand. Hollis knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges, but he also knew that change wasn't achieved by playing it safe. It was achieved by pushing forward, even when it felt like the world was pushing back. He wasn't just fighting for reform in the justice system. He was fighting for a future where the law would serve not just to punish, but to heal and restore. And that was a fight worth every ounce of resistance. Months had passed since Judge Hollis had made the decision to follow the path of justice reform, and in that time, he had witnessed small victories and deep challenges. His courtrooms, once steeped in routine and tradition, were now filled with the quiet murmur of change. He had implemented new policies, such as offering alternatives to incarceration for first-time offenders, expanding diversion programs, and advocating for mental health resources for those who needed them most. The shift wasn't perfect, and the road was still long, but Hollis felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. One morning, Hollis received a letter that made his heart skip a beat. It was an invitation to a national conference on criminal justice reform, an event attended by some of the most prominent advocates, policymakers, and legal experts in the country. Naomi had been instrumental in recommending him for this event, and the letter was a testament to the strides he had made in a short amount of time. He had gone from being a judge caught in the machinery of the status quo to someone who was now being recognized as part of the solution. The invitation was a significant moment for Hollis, but it wasn't just about the prestige or the recognition. It was a marker of the transformation he had undergone. He remembered the first time Naomi had challenged him to look beyond his role as a judge and understand the human stories behind every case. Back then, the very idea of approaching the law with empathy had felt foreign to him, but now it felt natural. He understood now that the law was not just a set of rules to be enforced, but a framework that should uphold the dignity of all people. At the conference, Hollis was among leaders who shared his vision, but he was also among those who had been in the trenches for far longer than he had. His heart pounded as he took the stage to speak. Naomi sat in the front row, offering him a reassuring smile. She had stood by him every step of the way, her quiet strength and unshakable resolve always present, even in the face of the enormous challenges they had both faced. Hollis was no longer the man who had imposed a fine on Naomi all those months ago. He had become a part of something much larger than himself. When it was his turn to speak, he stepped up to the microphone, his palms slightly sweaty but his mind clear. The room fell silent as he spoke. "I once thought that being a judge meant simply enforcing the law, ensuring that justice was served. But I've learned that justice is more than following rules. It's about understanding, compassion, and the willingness to adapt when the system fails. I've seen too many people fall through the cracks, too many lives ruined by a system that doesn't prioritize rehabilitation or the opportunity for second chances." His voice grew stronger as he continued. "I am not here to claim that I have all the answers. I am here to say that I've learned the hard way, and I am committed to doing better. We have the power to reshape the justice system into something that works for everyone, not just the privileged few. It's not going to be easy, but if we truly believe in fairness and equality, we must act on that belief." The audience was silent for a moment before applause erupted throughout the room. It wasn't just applause for his words. It was recognition of the journey he had taken, the courage to change, and the responsibility he now carried. Hollis felt a lump form in his throat as he looked out over the crowd, feeling the weight of it all. He had come so far, but he knew that the work was far from over. Naomi stood at the back of the room, her eyes shining with pride. Hollis had become something she had always believed he could be. A champion for change, a leader willing to challenge the system he had once upheld without question. Together, they had made strides toward a more just and compassionate future, but their work was just beginning. As the conference wrapped up, Hollis returned to his courtroom, now more resolute than ever in his mission. He had seen firsthand how the law could be an instrument of change, and he knew that his role in the system had the power to transform lives. Every case, every decision was an opportunity to do justice differently. No longer would he simply follow the law, he would bend it toward fairness, compassion, and opportunity. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be resistance, there would be setbacks, and there would be times when progress felt slow. But for the first time, Hollis knew that the fight was worth it. He had found his true calling, not as a figure of authority, but as an advocate for a better, more humane justice system. As he looked to the future, Hollis knew that the changes they had made were just the beginning. With Naomi by his side, he was ready to continue fighting for a justice system that worked for everyone, no matter their background, race, or circumstance. And in that fight, he had found not just purpose, but hope.